Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraphin. This time we're going to be talking about near-death experiences. Our guest is Dr. Kenneth Ring, a professor of psychology at the University of Connecticut and president of the International Association of Near-Death Studies. Dr. Ring is the author of Life at Death, a scientific investigation of the near-death experience, and the forthcoming book, The Omega Point. What is a near-death experience?
Charlie, a near-death experience occurs when somebody is very physically close to death and is an experience that involves several different elements. There's, first of all, usually reported a sense of tremendous peace and well-being, just a tremendous kind of ecstasy or bliss. Then what follows after that is a sense of being separate from the physical body and sometimes being able to see the physical body as though elevated above it and seeing it as a spectator would. Then what will follow is, if it's a typical kind of experience of the sort that we've studied, sense of moving through a darkness, a dark space, sometimes described as something like a tunnel, into or toward and into a beautiful, brilliant, bright but not blinding white or golden light that seems to exude feelings of warmth, of love, of acceptance, of forgiveness, of perfection. It's a very powerful experience for people who have it. And there are other aspects of the experience, but I would say those are among the more common components that have been reported by thousands of people that we've had a chance to interview over the last 7 years.
Have you been able to determine statistically what percentage of people who are clinically dead and then are found to be alive, or who are involved in physical near-death experiences, experience the near-death experience?
Yeah. The best estimate that we have for that statistics comes from the pollster George Gallup, who published a book a couple of years ago called Adventures in Immortality. His guess is, on the basis of his random sample, that about 35% of people who come close to death will have this kind of experience or a portion of it. And that's pretty consistent with some of the earlier findings based on smaller sample sizes.
For those 3 or 4 people then out of 10 that experience a near-death experience, are there any similarities in terms of the type of physical injury that they have?
No, actually what we have found, and this is pretty consistent throughout all the research, is that essentially it doesn't make any difference how you die in respect to the kind of experience that you will have. In other words, you can have an accident, you can be near close to death as a result of an illness, a surgical intervention, a suicide attempt, or whatever it might be. But once you pass over that threshold, it's then a pretty much common experience. The similarities among these experiences are far more impressive than the differences are.
Age, sex?
No, those factors don't make any difference. Even children very young, 2 or 3 or 4 years old, will have experiences which, when they relate them, seem virtually identical to those that have been reported by adults. There are no demographic correlates that have so far been identified with this experience.
So what has been the focus of your research?
Most recently, it's been on the after effects of this experience. My initial work that I reported in Life at Death was an attempt to provide as much statistical information and documentation for these experiences because the early research in this field was mostly anecdotal. Recently, and in the book you mentioned, by the way, the title is not The Omega Point, but Heading Toward Omega. But in any event, the focus of that research is mainly on the after effects and the meaning of these experiences. In other words, what kinds of changes does the near-death experience put people through afterward?
As you went through and interviewed people and looked into individual situations, did you find some that were totally outside the pattern, and what did you make of those?
I found a few that were. I found a small number in my first investigation that had idiosyncratic patterns. In other words, there was a pattern that an individual that would be reported by nobody else and seemed to have the quality of an hallucination. Whereas when you ask people who have this kind of classic near-death experience, whether it was an hallucination or dreamlike, they're very emphatic that it was not. for them it was a very real experience, hyper real, more real, they'd say, than you and I sitting here talking about it is real. But for these idiosyncratic experiences that followed no particular pattern, there was a sense that it wasn't really quite real, it was an hallucination or something like that. I found that in a very small percentage of cases, and though I myself have never talked and formally interviewed anybody that had a predominantly negative experience, others have, and they seem to constitute a very small fraction of these cases also. Maybe something like 1 or 2%. That's George Gallup's estimate, which I think is probably the most reliable figure. So there are a few cases, yes, out of every 100 that will not conform to the common pattern. Of course, the majority of persons who come close to death, as I've already implied, will have no conscious recall of the experience. Not to say that they may not have had one, but they will not be able to remember it. Just as everybody dreams at night, but not everybody can recall their dreams, it may be that more people than the 35 or 40% say that we've talked about as having these experiences will actually have one, but only 35 or so percent will be able to remember them or be willing to share them. There's a lot of resistance that a lot of people have, even today, after a lot of information has come out about these experiences, sharing them, because for a lot of people it's not only private, but it's the most profound experience they've ever had, and it has a quality of sacredness for some people, and it's not the sort of thing that's trotted out on on all random near-death occasions to talk about at cocktail parties and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And people are sometimes reluctant to share them even with very close friends or husbands and wives and so on. So there could very well be a fairly large sample of persons who may have had this kind of experience but have not been willing to be forthcoming to talk about it.
Have you been able to get at it through hypnosis or to pull it out of the subconscious when it isn't there in the conscious mind?
I've never done that, but I've heard that other researchers have done this on a limited scale and apparently with some success. There's not been, to my knowledge, any formal research project along these lines that's been done, but I have heard of at least a couple of cases where a person had no conscious recall of a near-death experience, but under hypnosis apparently was able to get in touch with it. We don't know how common this is. I wouldn't want to make any blanket claims because the research just isn't sufficient to support those claims at this point.
You mentioned that many of the people who recount near-death experiences talk about it being extremely real and extremely vivid and has a reality above everyday life.
Yes.
I'm wondering if it isn't a part of human nature sometimes, and I'm thinking of, and keeps flashing into my head, so I'll say it and then I can get it out of my mind. Fishing experiences that I've had where once caught an eel and pulled it up onto some rocks and it was there for just a minute and then dropped away and fell back into the water. Another time a huge fish came up and snapped off the bait just as I was about to put it back in the boat. In time, as you relate the story, as you think about the story, the eel grew, and I'm sure the fish grew, and to a point where it's difficult to pinpoint these experiences, and I'm wondering whether you've been able to get through any layering, or if there is any layering in the expression of the experience.
Well, there can sometimes be, of course, and I found that to, I'd say, a negligible extent, but it's been my experience that I've been able to interview people relatively soon after their near-death encounters so as to hear it relatively fresh. I'm often the first person that is told this experience by an individual. And then because I find these persons attractive, and in terms of the kinds of qualities they have, I've wound up spending a lot of time with them. For many years in Connecticut, I lived in a converted inn that we used to call the Near-Death Hotel, because so many people that I would meet in the course of my research would want to come by, and so we would generally become friends, and our relationship changed. And rather than being, researcher-client or researcher-respondent, we would simply be friends and talk. And then I would invite these persons to share their experiences with other audiences, with my classes on programs and so on. And I'm struck with the reliability of the testimony. For the most part, these accounts are not inflated, they're not distorted. It's as though it is a shiningly clear, crystal precise experience that isn't even like a memory. It's as though you go to it and you narrate it very much in the same way, as though you can't possibly forget it, and to embellish it would be to lie about it. And since it has this quality of not only profundity but sacredness, a person wouldn't want to do violence to it. So for the most part, that doesn't seem to be a problem. And I know there's at least one study that's looked at the reliability of these accounts and found it to be pretty high, which accords with my informal experience. So I don't think that's a significant factor.
Give us one of the specific anecdotes, if you will. Tell us a little bit about the individual, what kind of an experience they had, how they were near death, and what they related to you.
Okay, I have a friend now by the name of Tom Sawyer, and that's his actual name. Okay. It's a funny story how he got his name, but I guess we perhaps don't have time for that part of the anecdote. Tom was lying under a truck one day. He was working on his truck underneath, and the supports of the truck gave way. It fell on him, crushed his chest. He had an experience where, and this is very common in these accounts, he went through something like a tunnel. Although he said it occurred very fast, he felt that he was moving through the tunnel at the speed of light. It takes him longer to narrate this account than it apparently did actually to occur. And then he found himself approaching a pinpoint of light which grew larger, which grew more brilliant, which had all the qualities of warmth and love and total acceptance. He moved into the light and felt sort of a oneness with the light. And he says that he not only felt total acceptance and total love, but he experienced what other near-death experiences sometimes described as total knowledge. And he said that it's like being plugged into I don't think this was his phrase, but a cosmic computer, where if you could form the basis for any question that you might want to ask, the answer instantaneously and telepathically would be made known to you. Now, Tom, in terms of his background, was at various points in his life a garbage man. He was a carpenter. He was a driver of heavy bulldozer equipment. But he seemed to have questions in his mind at that time, according to how he narrates this particular experience, that had to do with physics. And he got a lot of information about modern physics, which he knows that he had not learned or absorbed before, because he was basically not interested in that sort of thing as a high school student. He only has a high school student education. But he got a lot of information about quantum theory, and the result of all of this was for him that he found himself so absorbed in these kinds of studies that he actually went back to college for a time and studied physics and mathematics, because he said of the tutelage that he got, well, he was in the light. Now, I'm not saying that's a typical kind of experience. It's a little bit unusual, but it is similar in the sense that it had a very profound effect on Tom's way of being in the world afterward.
And what was his physical experience during the time that he was experiencing this special state?
He was typical of near-death experiences in that he said he had tremendous pain because he was unable to breathe. He said that he was aware of his tongue sticking out. He could not put his tongue back into his mouth. And he said he was also aware of hearing his heart pounding inside, then slowing, and then stopping. He says he had no perceptible heartbeat. But as soon as he passed into this experience where the first thing he was aware of was some color, and then immediately afterward, kind of a velvety darkness. As soon as he entered into that state, he felt very comfortable. He had no pain of any kind or any bodily sensation until after he was recovered by paramedics. And it's typical that there's an abrupt transition for people who may have extraordinary pain, say as a result of some kind of accident or illness that they're suffering. As soon as they pass into this state, all pain ceases. And it's not just the absence of pain that they're aware of, but a tremendous feeling of peace, well-being, serenity. One person said that if you took the 1,000 best things that ever happened to you and multiplied them by 1,000,000, then maybe you'd have some idea of what this experience feels like. It's just totally off the continuum of ordinary human experience, according to these accounts, which are generally stated in very superlative and possibly to our ordinary understanding exaggerated terms, but it seems very faithful to the experience as far as these people are concerned.
How much time elapsed for Tom Sawyer during the time that he experienced an out-of-body?
The best guess that we have from the records of his case is less than 3 minutes, I would say, and that's fairly typical too. A lot of these experiences will take place within a minute or two.
Was it a minute or two in his time reference, or?
No, it was eternity. You see, one of the things about the state that makes it awfully difficult for people who've had this experience to communicate it afterward is, in these states, there isn't any sense of time. One woman said, and I think she speaks for many, she said, it could have been a second, it could have been a year, it could have been 1,000,000 years. It didn't matter, because time is a construct that simply doesn't compute in that state of consciousness. We know approximately what it was because they were witnesses to this particular event, and because of looking at the records afterward. In Tom's case, it seems to have been something less than 3 minutes before he was extricated from the truck, and after which his heart had stopped.
When more than one person dies, a plane crash, and 14 people are killed, are there any records of those people sharing near-death experience?
That's an excellent question, and I wish I had an answer to that. I have not talked with people, at least 2 people who have been involved in that kind of incident where multiple numbers of people die. I have heard anecdotal accounts of that kind by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, but I've not seen anything published, and I don't recall talking specifically to any researcher about that. So I really couldn't say about that.
Did any of the people who related near-death experiences talk about encountering other individuals in that state?
Many do, and the typical account that involves the perception of others is either a person is aware of a deceased relative who nevertheless looks very healthy, or a deceased friend, or they're aware of some kind of religious personage, and there's usually a telepathic communication. This state is totally telepathic in terms of the communication that's involved anyway. Normally, these encounters involve a telepathic injunction to return to physical life. You've got to go back. It's not your time. You still have work to do. We're not ready for you yet. Something like that. So it's short and sweet. It's as though whoever prepares these scripts was very much influenced by Hemingway, because they're very much pithy and to the point, and take that particular form. They may be somewhat more extended in some instances, but basically that's normally what happens in the case where other persons are perceived.
Are these telepathic experiences, conversations, ever with individuals who have passed before them into into death, or individuals that they could recognize?
They are with individuals that they recognize, at least sometimes, although sometimes they don't know the persons to whom they're talking. I suspect there may be cases where people may have felt that they talked with somebody who was still alive, but they're not typical, and I don't recall in the interviews that I've done, which number in the hundreds, any case of that kind. I wouldn't say it doesn't happen, but I would say overwhelmingly the persons who are perceived are persons who have died, and in some cases they're persons who have died so recently that the individual having the experience is not aware, has not been told that these individuals have died, and yet there they are.
In your book, Life and Death, you describe a case that shows that people can actually see things going on in different places at the same time. How does that work?
I don't know how it works, but I can tell you a story if you like. It doesn't. I've had cases that are similar to this, but perhaps not as dramatic. This involves another researcher. She was very skeptical about these experiences. In fact, had no real interest in them until the following case occurred. A migrant worker was visiting in this particular locality, had come into the hospital for the first time in this particular locality in the evening as a result of having cardiac distress, eventually had a cardiac arrest, and the following morning when she was recovered, told this particular individual, my friend, that she had had an out-of-the-body experience, so that wasn't her word for it, but she said she was up above in the corner of the room looking down and could see all the stuff and what's going on, could report the conversation. And my friend felt, well, this is possible, but on the other hand, this could simply be a reconstruction on the basis of stuff that she had overheard or put together on the basis of the information that was disclosed to her afterward and so on. Mm-hmm. But then the individual said, the next thing I knew, I was no longer in the room, but I was outside the hospital, and I was up above the third floor. And I saw a ledge, and my attention was drawn to a tennis shoe on the ledge. And she said that she was eyeballed a shoelace, as it were, with this tennis shoe. And she could see it very, very clearly, even though this was at night. She could see that the shoelace, for example, was underneath the heel of the tennis shoe, and she could see also places where the tennis shoe was very worn. And she described this tennis shoe with great precision to my friend, who then took a stronger interest in this possibility. Either this is a very interesting hallucination or something's going on. So my friend actually went up to the third floor on the north side of the building, and she made all these excuses to the patients who were there about, excuse me, but she'd go to look at the ledge, and she couldn't find anything until finally she looked out one window, and she looked down this little narrow ledge, and there was the tennis shoe, just as it was described. And she had it hauled in, and she brought it to Maria, and she said, is this what you saw? She says, exactly. Now, we don't know how this happens. We don't have a good explanation for this, but there are many examples in the literature and near-death studies of people who were physically in a position unable to see anything, who could report something very accurately that was either in that room or at some distant location from their physical body. I don't know how to explain this. I can only say that this is a fairly regular kind of report on the part of people who have near-death experiences, and I guess all you could say is that if you want to use this concept, their psychic channels are opened up. They're opened up to forms of information that are not normally available to us in ordinary waking consciousness.
And I'm going to kind of twist the meaning a little bit, have near-death experiences ever been reported by individuals who were with other people that died?
Yes, they have, or at least something similar in that, For example, a person will, having a near-death experience, often report entering into a beautiful light and being bathed in that light. Sometimes people who are the witnesses to the death or near death of another feel that same light and feel drawn to it and report the same kind of experience as a witness to it. So that's not common, though, but it does occasionally happen.
You mentioned earlier when people come back, they sometimes hear voices saying, "We're not ready for you yet. Your time isn't up," and the kind of classic the fictional accounts that people would
Yeah.
put together for movies and whatnot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any other reasons or explanations given for why some people simply die and go on to the next level and some return?
Well, I don't know if it's an explanation, Charlie, but what people who have this experience normally will say is that there is sort of a clear sense as to whether or not it is one's time. And the gist of the message is it isn't your time. Now, unfortunately, for the people presumably for whom it is their time, these are the people that are reluctant to respond to interviews, or answer questionnaires. These are the people that pass on, and so we don't have kind of a control group, as it were. So we only have like half of the story. But normally there's a sense of people have the feeling that there's some kind of a design or a plan or a blueprint for their life, and that we have free will as to whether or not we live in accordance with that plan. But when your time is up, presumably it's time to go. And for that reason, I think, at least in part, when people come back from this kind of experience, they often say that they lose their fear of death totally. And it seems to be a permanent change in their perception of this. And maybe in part the reason for that is that they know when their time is right, they'll go. And so they can live more easily and more freely afterward as a result.
If it were done by the textbook, these people would all take a new look at life. They have a new lease on life. There are all kinds of expressions that we could use.
Yes.
They would give up their bad habits. They would engage themselves in fruitful activity, socially redeeming activities, and that sort of thing. Is that normally the case?
And to a large extent, I would have to say there is a good measure of truth in that. Their attitude toward life does change, and often does change drastically, so that they appreciate life more. They certainly wouldn't describe themselves as saints afterward. They still have their faults. They are aware of them. They're not changed in that respect. But they seem to have a greater concern for others. A lot of them, for example, are moved to work with others, especially dying people. They seem to have more compassion for others, more patience, more tolerance. They seem especially to be able to express love easily, more easily than they could before. They feel this is very important. They seem to be less interested in material things for their own sake. They seem, the general pattern that I've observed and that has been commented on by other researchers as well, that I talk about in Heading Toward Omega, is they have a more spiritual orientation toward the world, or at least they feel that they're moving in that direction. I don't know that they would say, or that I would say, that they're better people, but they seem to have an attitude toward life that emphasizes what really matters. Their values, they're pretty clear about their values. Love matters. Caring for others matters. Caring for the earth matters. And many of them seem to change their lives so as to be able to reflect those values. They may, in fact, change their jobs, and I've talked with a number of people who have, and who the general pattern is to move into a situation where they can work in some way with others or for others, and express the kind of love that they have for others in some fashion or other, that gives them a sense of real fulfillment, that gives them a feeling that they are living in accordance with whatever they felt that they were taught and experienced during the time that they were close to death.
You mentioned a gentleman named Tom Sawyer early on that went from working on trucks and heavy equipment and that sort of thing into college education in math and physics. Is he doing something that has some real powerful socially redeeming value?
Well, interestingly, what's happened to Tom is he's still driving bulldozers, and he still has the same job, but he has become known in his area as a person of very considerable charisma and one who possesses many psychic or clairvoyant gifts. And what has happened to him as a result of the publicity about his case is that many people have come to him essentially for counseling, for therapy, for insight about life. And he sort of has two jobs. He has his regular job, but he works a lot with people in this way. And in that respect, he's typical of a fair number of near-death experiences that I know that seem to be drawn to interact with people this way. They often say, and by the way, a lot of these changes that I reported seem to be picked up by people who are close to these individuals, that is, by their friends and family who knew them well before their incident and afterward. They acknowledge that these changes have occurred, although they wouldn't necessarily always evaluate them in the same way. And a lot of them say that they do have a lot of understanding of others' problems. Others seem to come to them with their problems. They seem to have more insight into others' problems. They seem to have a greater ability to accept people as they are, with their whatever faults they may have, just as they have a greater ability to accept themselves as well. And I think that comes from the tremendous affirmation that they get from the light. You know, the light, which is almost like a presence. It's not a person, but it has a sense of a presence often. Seems to give kind of an unconditional acceptance to who we are, the essence of ourselves, and people seem to bring back that sense of affirmation with them. And that's why I think they're easy in themselves afterward. They lose their fear of death, and they have a very easy time relating to others and understanding empathetically what others' problems are.
There are two individuals now that come to mind real quickly that had experiences. I'm not certain what the physical extent of their injuries were, whether there were in fact near-death experiences, but President Reagan and Pope John Paul both were attacked by assassins, were hospitalized and underwent some considerable pain, and are now back on their feet and living normal lives. Are there any instances that you know of particularly famous people through history that underwent near-death experiences?
Well, I don't make a habit of reading the National Enquirer, but about every other issue it seems that some famous celebrity has had this particular kind of experience. I think Elizabeth Taylor, for example, has had them. And I know that there are many other persons who have had them and have shared them. And people tell me, I must confess, Charlie, I don't remember the names offhand, but they saw a talk show or something like that, and some personage, celebrity or author, whatever we'll describe, having had a near-death experience. One of the things that we found, though, is that these experiences sort of take place across the board. It doesn't matter what kind of person you are, what educational level, anything like that. It's in my trade, we would say it's a random variable. It just doesn't seem to pick any favorites, and anybody is a candidate for this particular kind of experience.
Where are we going with this? What effect might your research have on modern medicine?
I think we're getting a new understanding of death. I think that's one of the very clear implications, in the sense that most of us have been raised with an understanding of death that looks at it from the outside. If we see someone, say, dying of cancer, if we see somebody who dies of an automobile accident, we see someone in an old age home, for example, that's very close to death and maybe seems to be almost a caricature of a real person. It's natural to fear death, to move away from it, to be repelled by it, not to want to think about it. But if you understand death from the inside, from what the experience of dying is, quite apart from what it looks like, you see that the actual experience of death is very different from the appearance of death. That there's a very beautiful interior understanding of what death is that complements the kind of unpleasant and physically disturbing external view of death. And I think that we need both of these perspectives to take into account in order to have a fuller understanding of what death is and what death may have to teach us. So I think that dual perspective is coming into vogue now. And I've talked with a lot of nurses, for example, who work on resuscitation teams. And a part of them is, of course, focused on the physical body and the necessity to resuscitate that body. But these people are now aware that maybe it's not just the body that they have to be concerned with, but up there in the corner of the room, there's somebody who's saying, hey, I feel very peaceful. I am fine. I am so happy. Don't bring me back. I want to stay where I am. Could create a certain kind of ethical conflict or psychological conflict, but it's there. Many people report it. And so I think more people are becoming sensitive to multiple perspectives that we take toward death now that formerly just would not have been available before this research was well known. I think it's absolutely clear that however this experience be interpreted, that there's no doubt that it occurs. I mean, in George Gallup has estimated that as many as 8 million adult Americans have had this experience. We're not just talking about a few thousand cases. And the implications of this experience for medicine need certainly to be taken into account, not only for what people may experience at the time, but for the kind of anxieties or confusions that they may have immediately after the experience. And some of the work that we're trying to do is to make clinicians, health professionals, and so on aware of the implications of this experience so they can relate more sensitively to the people who have had this kind of experience.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.